Welcome to this week's Who the Folk podcast. I'm Lonnie Goldsmith, the editor of TC Jewfolk. This week I sit down with Meyer Weinshel, a Ph.D. candidate at the University of Minnesota who is teaching Yiddish to people around the Twin Cities, most recently in a class offered by Jewish Community Action. Meyer talks about how he got started, about the resurgence of Yiddish in the 21st century, and even tries to teach me a sign-off, which did not go well, on this week's Who the Folk podcast.
Meyer Weinshel, welcome to this week's Who the Folk podcast. Thank you for joining us.
And thank you for having me.
So, Meyer, you are currently a PhD student at the University of Minnesota, teach some undergraduate coursework, but you had emailed me on wanting to talk because you are a Yiddish instructor.
Correct. Yeah. Generally, when I teach at the university as a graduate student, I teach courses in German. But yeah, since I don't know, about a year and a half ago, I began teaching beginner Yiddish courses in the Twin Cities.
What is it about Yiddish that had you interested in teaching? And sort of to follow on from that, where did you first get interested in Yiddish?
Yeah, I'll start with perhaps the second question. I started learning Yiddish as a graduate student. I went to New York I started learning Yiddish in New York in 2015 at YIVO. YIVO is an institution that was founded in interwar, then Poland, now Vilna is in Lithuania. But YIVO is an institution currently based in New York, and they run a summer program for Yiddish at varying levels. So I started learning Yiddish there and spent several summers doing that. I was in Lithuania for a summer and then went back to New York. And the rest is sort of history. But in terms of teaching, I had by that point also started teaching at the U. And any scholar, teacher of language and literature knows the importance of teaching and language teaching in particular. So I got to the level that I could speak and use Yiddish to teach. So I started doing that. And there's some other steps involved as well, but I'm sure we'll get to talking about that.
For sure. So I guess what drew you to wanting to learn Yiddish in the first place back in 2015?
Yeah, it was a pretty practical. I had a pretty practical reason. I needed to learn additional languages as a graduate student, and my advisor, who was quite wise, suggested that I look into Yiddish, and I did, and it became quickly apparent, based on my interest with Jewish studies and literature, that was a good suggestion to give me. And I ultimately really actually fell in love with Yiddish. It didn't take long for me to catch this bug. So yeah. So it started as for practical reasons, and then ultimately morphed into something more complicated and long-term.
So what was it about the language? You said you fell in love with it pretty quickly. What was there something in particular about what you had learned that made it such a sort of quick, that you grasped onto so quickly?
Yeah, it helped coming to Yiddish, having learned another language, and particularly German. About 70 to 80% of Yiddish vocabulary is Germanic. So there are cognates between German and Yiddish that were very helpful, but ultimately it was also, there was something more complicated to that, in that it was a language that really spoke to, it sounds cliche, but it did. It spoke to my past. It spoke to my family's past. It felt very strange as a beginner student, but it also felt the language felt very familiar at the same time. So there was something that became quickly apparent to me, even in the first week or so of class, that drew me to Yiddish and ultimately led me to keep going, keep learning the language.
So are there any pockets of the world, you mentioned you traveled to Lithuania in sort of the course of your studies, are there pockets where Yiddish is still regularly spoken amongst segments of a population, particularly in Europe, since you went there?
Yeah, so most of the Yiddish speakers today, of course, are Hasidic, And the largest communities are in, well, New York, but in other parts of North America too. Montreal is another location. But in Europe, Antwerp has a sizable Hasidic community that speaks Yiddish. There are pockets of Yiddish speakers, certainly after the Second World War, but since then, many of these speakers are dying or have died, and those populations have dwindled. But even in Jerusalem, there are pockets, of course, of Yiddish speakers also. Haredim in Jerusalem who speak Yiddish. But in terms of those who speak Yiddish, it's also quite complex and interesting. Of course, I'm not Hasidic. I didn't grow up Hasidic. There are many people with my background who have for generations now simply learned Yiddish either as native speakers from their parents or grandparents, and as well as people like me who learned it as a second, third, fourth language. So yes, in terms of actual communities of speakers, there are who use it as a living, breathing language on a daily basis, but there are also those who, within their own language communities, shall we say, or demographics, speak Yiddish also on a regular basis. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. Now, you mentioned there's Germanic roots, and that is the subject of your graduate studies, correct?
Correct. So I'm housed in a German department. The official name of the department is German, Nordic, Slavic, and Dutch. It's a mouthful, but so I'm in what was ultimately historically a German department. So my work does have, in terms of literature, a German language component as well. But in terms of the Yiddish language, in a semi-related but unrelated note, yes, Yiddish is what is known as a fusion language. There are many, every language I would argue is a fusion language to some extent, but Yiddish is a fusion language where about 70 to 80% of Yiddish syntax and vocabulary comes from has Germanic origins. And then the other percentages of Yiddish come from Slavic, come from Lashon Kodesh, so words that are from Biblical Hebrew and Aramaic. And then there's also a small Romance language component, and that comes from, of course, Jewish settlement in Central and Western Europe, and the Romance languages that are ours and are still spoken in those regions.
And of course, I couldn't read Yiddish to save my life, but I've seen enough to know that the characters are Hebrew characters.
Correct. So like many Jewish languages, Yiddish being just one of them, it's historically written and generally written with Hebrew characters. Exactly. So Yiddish isn't unique in that respect, but yes, in the overall written accounts of Yiddish that we have, they were largely written with Hebrew characters. Correct.
So I was lucky enough earlier this year, and I had to think back, but it actually was still 2020 when this happened, as long as this year has felt like it's been, where I got to interview the two guys from Midlife Crisis before they performed in the Twin Cities, as part of the Twin Cities Jewish Humor Festival. And, between sort of them on that level, you teaching these classes through Jewish Community Action to people who want to learn Yiddish, and your own studies to, strengthen your grasp and use of the language. Does it feel like there's sort of this Yiddish revival here in the 21st century?
Yeah, I think there's two parts to that question. I would argue that this question of Yiddish being revived or revitalized has been an ongoing question since the Second World War, and there have been several generations of people active in these so-called revitalization movements, and they might be musicians in the klezmer revival, they might be Yiddish instructors. It's a very dynamic group of people. But in terms of what's happening now, I would actually argue that some things are changing, and for the better. Technology certainly has helped Yiddish immensely. Even before the pandemic, language courses were being offered increasingly online, which meant that people all over the world could take Yiddish courses at varying levels and take classes from instructors based all over the world who have very interesting levels of expertise and very vital contributions to Yiddish. So those are things that have certainly changed and for the better. And I think that has actually fueled a different level of engagement as of late in the last maybe 10, 20 years, I would say.
Okay. And, you know, one of the interesting things you had mentioned to me before we started recording was that one of the neat things that you've been able to do through your teaching through the JCA class is that you're one of the pilot teachers of a new textbook, a new Yiddish textbook.
Correct. So,
I guess talk a little bit about how you got to be picked to do that, and how did you find that new, sort of a modern textbook for a not so modern language?
Correct. So, Yiddish. So the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts, that was founded. The Book Center was founded in 1980. And the mission of the book center was to rescue, more or less, the remaining Yiddish books around the world. And Aaron Lansky, the founder, and those working with him recovered ultimately, I mean, up to this point in 2020, they've recovered, I think, well over 1 million Yiddish books. And many of those books have been digitized and are available free of charge online. So this is the type of organization that is now publishing a textbook, a new textbook. And yeah, new Yiddish textbooks for secular audiences don't, and secular meaning non-Hasidic audiences. The term secular versus religious is also not very useful binary.
It feels like a tricky definition compared to how it's used outside of this topic, right?
Correct. In Yiddish, the term is often known as Weltlich, being Weltlich, not religious. And again, that also has its own weighted connotations. But yeah, so for so-called secular audiences, new textbooks are not very common. There might be one or two that come out, arguably in one language, in English, for example, every generation or two since the Second World War. So this doesn't happen very often. But the director of the Yiddish Language Institute at the Book Center, Asya Weissman-Schulman, and two other co-authors, Jordan Brown and Michal Yashinsky, have created this massive textbook. It's 800 or 900 pages, meant to be used over several years or semesters, I should say, actually, of university study, but I've also used it, of course, with JCA. And it started a little over, let's see, now 2 years ago. Yeah. So I applied to the program. They were looking for people to pilot this forthcoming textbook, which is finally being published this summer. And I applied, was accepted, and we spent three weekends in Amherst, testing the textbook together, coming up with mock lessons to teach each other, pretending, one of us was a teacher, the others were the students, and getting acquainted with the resources that were built into the textbook. So that's how that started. And I'm trying to think what else was part of that question. I then contacted Karen Moratz at JCA and asked if they would be interested in Yiddish courses, and she was, of course, very enthusiastic, and so was Lauren Muscaplat, and that's how that started. But yeah, the book, as I said, is coming out this summer, and it's unique for several reasons. It's extensive, it's expansive and exhaustive, but it includes a lot of digital technology and resources that earlier Yiddish textbooks didn't have. I mean, people didn't have the resources to come up with these materials. So that's one of the big differences with this.
Well, and at 900 pages, expansive was probably a good adjective for it. Yeah. I just find it fascinating that, again, a language that, people of, my generation and certainly younger might have thought of as a dead language.
Yeah.
Frankly, is cranking, that there's an organization that's cranking out this expansive textbook that incorporates digital assets as well to
Mhm.
help the learning process. That's not something you would necessarily expect out of, Yiddish in 2020.
Right. So it's a common perception, and I'm happy to get into this, as I think a really important and interesting topic. Um, Yiddish Yiddish faces a lot of challenges, as do, I mean, in many ways, the challenges facing Yiddish teachers or pedagogy and the study of Yiddish isn't unique to Yiddish. Spanish teachers might echo some of the concerns that I have around teaching materials or teaching opportunities. Certainly in German, this is the case. I mean, there are ways in which this isn't unique, but what is unique about Yiddish, I think, is that Yiddish suffered two catastrophic moments in the last century, in the 20th century. First was the Holocaust, where about 4.5 to 5 million of the 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust were Yiddish speaking. So that greatly reduced the number of speakers very, very quickly. And then in Eastern Europe, with Stalinism and Stalinist repression after the war, Yiddish also was repressed. And finally, due to displacement, Jews emigrated to North America. Ashkenazi Jews emigrated all around the world, therefore leaving their ancestral language behind, certainly in Anglophone countries. But certainly the Yiddish speakers who ended up in pre-48 Palestine and later Israel also had a very difficult time, shall we say, continuing with Yiddish and passing the language on to their children. And I would argue, where I think Yiddish sometimes has similarities to languages that are spoken by groups who have been victims of genocide as well. This is also what happens to the discourse around the language. The language becomes discarded, is seen as not valuable, as not modern, for example, even though Yiddish culture as it existed in the 20th century was incredibly modern, incredibly dynamic, incredibly diverse. So yeah, I could go on and on. It's a very important and very complex topic.
Oh, no question. And I think it sounds like, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds to me like what happened with Yiddish as people became displaced from their home areas, home regions, home countries, post World War II and the Holocaust, that assimilation began to wear away some of the language. Where you move to America, you're forced to learn English, basically, and you move to Israel and you start leaning more towards Hebrew.
Yeah. No, exactly. And again, that disavowal or that rejection of the language is very complex. It doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen certainly within one generation. Maybe a lot of that undoing of fluency happens in one generation. But most American Jews most American Jews are of Ashkenazi descent, many of them have some familiarity with Yiddish, at least to an extent. I mean, what it is, where it was spoken, who spoke it. But in terms of these more complicated aspects of Yiddish as a vehicle for a vibrant press or a literature, and also certainly a day-to-day language, is muddled as a result. And right, for these reasons, whether immigrants ultimately pick up other languages or are forced to pick up other languages. The process of assimilation in the United States is of course quite complex too. It goes beyond just abandoning Yiddish, but it's absolutely it's that's a major factor. Yep.
Certainly. So where do you hope, teaching Yiddish long term sort of fits into your plan as you're, working towards completing your Ph.D.?
Yeah, that's a good question. I the realities of it are there is a lot of interest with Yiddish, but there isn't a lot of institutional support or visibility for it. So at least coming from at least multiple fields, whether that's a good or bad thing, I don't know. That's an entirely different discussion. But I would absolutely hope to continue teaching Yiddish at varying levels for the foreseeable future. And in particular, I'm interested in other Yiddish teachers are currently involved in these initiatives as well, getting people to start learning the Hebrew alphabet or Yiddish aleph base to learn Yiddish. That's one of the major hurdles, as many listeners probably are aware, to ultimately engaging with Yiddish long term. Without the ability to read and write with the Hebrew characters that Yiddish is written with, it's hard to move forward. So I really am interested in getting more programming around learning the alphabet going, depending upon where I end up, whether I stay here for a longer period of time or not.
So, was it grad school that brought you to the Twin Cities then, or are you? How long have you been in Minnesota for?
Oh, that's a great question. Off and on, I've been here for about 10 years. I did my undergraduate work also in the Twin Cities at Macalester, and then was away for a few years, and then came back to the U for graduate school.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So, what are you? I guess nominally speaking, then hoping to do. Like when you went into your PhD program, what did you think you were going to be doing with a PhD in Germanic
Mhm.
studies?
Ultimately teach and work at a college or university,
Okay.
and I definitely have those plans still. It's hard with the state of the economy right now and higher education right now, whether that will be a reality, but that's still the aspiring goal.
Yes.
But yeah, ultimately, my work certainly with Yiddish has led me to also perhaps engage with Jewish studies more broadly, with cultural organizations, even other maybe academic institutions that aren't specifically classroom teaching or research. So at libraries and archives. But yeah, I'm not sure. I would ideally like to stick to something language, Jewish studies related. Yeah.
Did you hear a lot of Yiddish growing up? I mean, I know I heard like bits and pieces from grandparents, like the occasional word mixed into an English conversation, but
Mhm.
not regularly. Were you the same way, or or was this all just sort of a later in life thing for you to pick this up?
Yeah, I would say my experience was quite similar. I had my parents were from different backgrounds. My mother converted to Judaism, but in many ways was quite literate in Jewish topics in a way that I think Jewish people who are born Jewish or grow up in a in a Jewish community take for granted. And my father, whose grandparents were from Eastern Europe, was ultimately, I think, at some point read or versed in Yiddish stories, children's stories and folklore. That's something that I heard growing up from him, not in Yiddish, but in English in
Okay.
translation. And then by the time I was growing up, most of my relatives who spoke Yiddish were unfortunately gone by that point, but there were still some left and were had at least firsthand experience with Yiddish speakers and therefore didn't have an overly romanticized view of the language. But nevertheless, my own experience, right, was filtered through them, was picked up as you mentioned later on when I started learning the language more seriously, and was able to find materials that were related to my family in Yiddish, but I of course hadn't known of before. So yeah.
So, are you part of this larger community of sort of what I'm guessing is mid 20 somethings that are learning and turning to teaching the language? Are you finding more of that, or not so much?
Yeah, and do you mean locally or elsewhere?
Oh, either, frankly.
Yeah.
I'm curious about just both the local, sort of back to the idea of what it feels like to me is either a local or more national resurgence in use of and speaking of and teaching of the language.
Yeah, so for example, in this Yiddish pedagogy program at the Yiddish Book Center, there were 15 of us, and most of us were based in the United States, but not all of us. And most of us, I don't know what the average age was, but certainly the average age was younger, shall we say, than what most people would picture a Yiddish teacher's age to be. And but all of us, well, I think for the overall majority of us, we all learned Yiddish at later points in life, meaning we weren't children growing up in a Yiddish speaking home. Some had, but not all. So yeah, most of the Yiddish teachers that I have worked with or am working with are around my age, or at least within the same generation. They're in their late 20s to late 30s. And locally, it's interesting too. I had, for example, the JCA class, the first JCA class that I taught had around 20 students sign up. I think a little less than that. And this time, however, and unfortunately with the pandemic, I continued the course online via Zoom, but over time numbers dwindled. But nevertheless, I had about 27 people sign up for this class.
Whoa.
And the ages for that ranged quite variably. We had high schoolers all the way through retirees. So, and then in terms of who ultimately goes on to do something more substantial with Yiddish beyond an introductory course, those demographics are similar. I've known people who are still in high school all the way through their 70s and 80s learning Yiddish. So, and working with it, teaching with it, or doing something in the community with it. Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Oh, that is so cool. So is there, either through JCA or on your own, or is there some other way for you to continue to, teach maybe an intro level course again, particularly in the pandemic age, and everybody I think has gotten accustomed to Zoom. Is
Right.
that something you're hoping to do maybe?
Yeah, I have spoken recently with JCA with Lauren at JCA in particular, and there is the possibility of more teaching in the works for this fall, and there'll be hopefully a larger variety of courses. I'd like to teach something that could suit the students that have taken my two classes before, but also, as I mentioned, yes. Teach a class for very, very beginners, those who want to learn the alphabet and some of the basics in that way. And then none of this has been finalized, but I would also enjoy, teaching a course, a short community course, very simple, on Yiddish literature and translation, because many of the works of Yiddish literature are not translated, have not been translated into English or any other language, but there are plenty of works to be read that most people, I would argue, are quite unfamiliar with. So I would love to create a discussion around Yiddish literature, perhaps its continued relevance or even irrelevance to discussions we're having in the Jewish community today, around bigger issues. So yeah, that's the plan. Nothing has been finalized, but there are some things in the works for the fall.
That is very cool and very exciting. And check out, TCG Folk hears about it. We will let you know, because I think it's such a cool opportunity for people to learn something new and interesting, as such as Yiddish. And it's really great that there is this resurgence, that especially as the generation who spoke it more regularly is starting to pass away, that there is this desire for it to live on, which is very cool. And I think it's sort of an important and less spoken of part of sort of our Jewish history.
Absolutely. And I think exactly. I think one of the things to keep in mind is that although demographics and culture shifts and adapts and changes, Jewish culture has shifted and geographically greatly over the last 150 years, and in ways that are very exciting and very dynamic. I think yet it's still very important. I mean, and again, Yiddish is not the only example of this. There are Jewish languages that are in need of further study and engagement. And if people are interested in learning them, they should, of course, find the opportunities to learn and engage with these topics. And in terms of Yiddish, exactly, you're absolutely right that the generations of speakers born either in Yiddish speaking communities outside of Eastern Europe, but certainly in Eastern Europe, as those populations are aging. It's also important to remember too that languages, there's a common saying that languages don't die, they're murdered. It takes a lot to kill off a language. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, genocide and state repression play a big role in that, but also community attitudes toward languages affect that as well. But nevertheless, exactly, there's a continued engagement with Yiddish because languages persist, languages adapt, evolve, and that's just the reality. So yeah.
Well, that is fantastic. All right, Meyer, last couple questions for you, and we'll get you out of here on those. What is your favorite Jewish food?
Oh, that's a good question. Jewish food. I would maybe have to say Hamantaschen or something beet related. I'm a big fan of beet dishes from Eastern Europe. So,
okay, interesting.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Very good. And your favorite Jewish holiday?
Oh, famous Jewish holiday. I thought I just said Hamantaschen. It's not Purim, but it's Passover. I would say Pesach is definitely
okay.
My favorite holiday.
Excellent. How come?
I love, at least not under pandemic situations, I love cooking for people and having a Seder of my own. That's another thing with Yiddish that I've done is I've created my own Yiddishist Haggadah that has a combination of English, Yiddish, Hebrew blessings and texts interwoven into it, and it's just a fun holiday. I love Passover. It's a springtime holiday. It's a wonderful holiday. Yep.
That's so cool. I mean, I think people make their own Haggadot all the time, but to incorporate Yiddish and Yiddish into the Hebrew and the English also is just, that's so cool that you've done that.
Yeah, and there are if people are interested, there are plenty of I don't know how bi or multilingual they are, but there are certainly Yiddish enhanced Haggadahs online that are available. So if people are interested, yeah, it's exactly it has the adapting of a Haggadah for your own Seder, is of course a long tradition, but of course Yiddishists today, but also 100 years ago, were doing the same thing and incorporating modern Yiddish culture into their Seders. So yeah.
That's awesome. All right. Okay. I do have one final question.
Okay.
How do you say thank you for joining us in Yiddish?
You can say Schönen Dank, großen Dank, Vielen Kommen, Vielen Herren, Vielen Schmusen. So for coming, for listening, and for chatting, yeah.
Okay, there were too many of them there. I lost.
So Schönen Dank.
Schönen Dank. Okay.
Schönen Dank, Vielen Kommen. You could say, for example, which means for coming.
Okay.
Vielen Herren, which is for listening. And Vielen Schmusen for the two of us. Vielen Schmusen for conversing, for chatting. We have schmooze in Yiddish. Schmusen is the Yiddish verb from schmooze.
Sure. I didn't really think of schmooze. Schmooze is just, I suppose it comes from Yiddish, doesn't it?
Exactly. Yep, it does.
The Who the Folk podcast.
I never would have thought of
Jew Folk
Okay,
podcast.
Again, that's
a product of Jew Folk.
Doing this memorized, I can't.
Please subscribe.
Meyer Weinshel, thank you for coming. Thank you for speaking with me.
If you have suggestions for other podcast guests,
super fascinating, and I'm excited to help
for our other shows. Check out
when you're starting teaching again in the area soon.
Wonderful, and thanks for chatting with me.